Who's to say what's worse and what's better? It's all bad and there's no way to rank that, so in no particular order, here are the top 10 secret shipwrecks that might be worse than the Titanic. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have the SS Sultana. Starting off heavy with this list today, we have one of the worst maritime disasters in US history, and it occurred on April 27, 1865. The SS Sultana was a side-wheel steamship, and on that fateful day, it exploded on the Mississippi River just north of Memphis, Tennessee. This incident took place in a time after the Civil War had just ended, and of course, the POWs held in Confederate military prisons were eager to get back to their homes after everything they had just endured. This led to the federal government paying a hefty price to steam operators for each soldier they took with them. This then led to a whole bunch of steam operators cutting corners so that they could bank on this deal. In the case of the Sultana, this meant safety things like repairing a leaky boiler or adhering to the capacity limits were cut. At the time of the explosion, the ship was carrying as many as 2,300 people, which was over 6 times the limited capacity. Unfortunately, the neglect of the boiler led to it rupturing, which initially took the lives of hundreds of those on board. After this, the already overloaded docks were made weaker and they ended up collapsing, which left people trapped. In the end, around 1,800 people lost their lives. While I'm sure there are many Americans and others from around the world who have heard of this tragic incident by now, at the time, not many people knew about it at all. If you remembered, this happened on April 27, 1865, and President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 14, 1865, which ended up overshadowing this tragic event in terms of coverage. And it's not like there was a 24-hour news cycle back then where they were just constantly being bombarded with the worst of the worst. Even today, where we do have that, terrible things get overlooked and overshadowed all of the time. In our number 9 spot today, we have the MV Dona Paz. This maritime disaster took place on December 20th, 1987, when this passenger ferry collided with the oil tanker, the MT Vector. The collision took place in the Tabla Strait, which is about 180 kilometers south of Manila. This ship was carrying more than 4,000 people, which was double its capacity, and at the time of the collision, there were no senior officers on the bridge of the ship, and on the Vector, there was no lookout, and it is thought that both ships lacked a functioning radio. That's what I like to call all bad. The weather and the waters were both quite calm when the collision happened, and despite the clear visibility, neither ship gave an indication that it noticed the other. When the collision occurred, the 8,800 barrels of oil and gasoline on the Vector quickly ignited and engulfed both ships in flames. Out of the over 4,400 people that were on board both ships, only 26 people were rescued from the waters and survived. It really makes you wonder exactly what happened here, because from an outside perspective, it seems like this tragedy could have been avoided. In our number 8 spot today, we have the MV Wilhelm Gustloff. This ship was a part of the Nazi Strength Through Joy program, which was an important propaganda tool during the Third Reich. This ocean liner is said to have carried German workers who were indulging in leisurely activities on cruises throughout the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean, but when World War II began, it ended up being converted into a hospital ship. Closer to the end of the war, this ship then switched gears again and was called on in order to evacuate German troops and civilians from East Prussia ahead of the advancing of the Soviet troops. At this time, the ship had shed its white paint with red crosses that symbolized it as non-combatant, and this, coupled with the clear presence of troops on board, as well as the anti-aircraft guns on board, well, it was obvious that this made it a viable military target. While it was built to accommodate around 1,900 people, on January 30th, 1945, as the ship left port, an estimated 10,000 people packed on board. Just after 9:00 p.m. that night, a Soviet submarine fired 3 torpedoes at the ship, which slammed into its side. Because of ice, many of the lifeboats were inoperable, and those who were on board that were best trained to deal with these kinds of emergencies and dire situations had either been killed in the blast or were trapped below the deck. Just over an hour later, the ship slipped underwater. Unlike a lot of the other wrecks on this list, rescue did begin just minutes after the SOS call was sent out, but still only 1,200 people were saved. With a death toll of somewhere around an estimated 9,000 people, this remains one of the deadliest shipwrecks in history. In our number 7 spot today, we have the HMS Victory. This is one of the oldest wrecks we have on this list today, and this one took place on October 5th, 1744. The HMS Victory was was a 100-gun Royal Navy vessel, and on October 3rd, just a couple days before the wreck, the ship was in a fleet reaching the English Channel. A storm ended up scattering the fleet all apart from each other, and on October 4th, the ships with the Victory lost sight of her. What happened to the HMS Victory remained a mystery for over 260 years, and it wasn't until 2009 that the fate was found out. Just 50 miles off the coast of England near Plymouth, the US company Odyssey Marine Exploration ended up finding the wreckage, and when found, the ship's cannons were still in good condition, with even the royal crests visible underwater, despite the nearly 3 centuries it had been. This was also the first time that any trace of the 1,150 sailors that were on the ship were found, as sadly no one in the entire crew survived the wreck. In our number 6 spot today, we have the SS Kiangya. On December 4th, 1948, this ship was carrying thousands of passengers who were fleeing Shanghai due to the advancing People's Liberation Army. On this day, the official number of passengers was said to be 2,150, which was already almost double its capacity rate, but it said that several thousand more people crowded onto the ship before it left the docks. I mean, this makes a lot of sense. It's weighing the risk of packing onto this boat versus staying in the situation you're currently trying to flee. As the ship got to the mouth of the Huangpu River, it is believed that it may have struck some sort of World War II era mine or something like that because it just exploded. Rescuers were also unaware of the explosion for hours, which only made the situation worse. Somewhere around 700 passengers were rescued, but this meant that a number estimated to be from 2,750 to as many as 4,000 people lost their lives in this explosion and the subsequent sinking of the ship. In our number 5 spot today, we have the RMS Empress of Ireland. The Empress of Ireland was a Canadian ocean liner that was out to sea on May 29th, 1914, when tragedy struck. The ship was traveling down the St. Lawrence River through some thick fog, which is what led to her colliding with a Norwegian collier, which is a bulky cargo ship that was designed in order to transport coal. The cargo ship didn't sink, but unfortunately the same couldn't be said for the Empress, as she listed and fast. Water began pouring in through portholes, which led to those below deck meeting their fate rapidly. The official death toll of the crash is said to have been 1,012 people, and it still remains the worst disaster in Canadian maritime history. It makes me wonder how, as a Canadian especially, I've never heard of this accident before. The wreck of this ship still lies in a fairly shallow 130 feet of water, which has made it a pretty popular diving location for those wishing to retrieve relics. In our number 4 spot today, we have the SS General Slocum. This passenger steamboat was built in Brooklyn, New York, and on June 15, 1904, it was carrying members of the St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church as they were on their way to a church picnic. They were traveling up the East River on the way to Long Island Sound when a fire started in the lamp room. Considering the fact that the lamp room was obviously filled with lamp oil, while a fire on board a ship is never good, this is one of the worst case scenarios. Actually, lamp oil, oil rigs, and nearby paint locker in a cabin filled with gasoline are actually what created this worst case scenario. The safety equipment of this ship was not nearly up to standards, as it was rarely even checked, and when the crew attempted to get the fire hose in order to put out the flames, they found a rotten fire hose that crumbled in their hands. The life jackets being given out to people began to fall apart, and they couldn't even access the lifeboats at all. I cannot even imagine the panic people were feeling at this point. Many of the passengers saw no other option and jumped into the water to try and swim, but like many Americans at the time, they didn't know how, and the heavy wool clothes they wore only worked to weigh them down. At the end of the day, it is said that around 1,021 people lost their lives in this absolutely tragic event. In our number 3 spot today, we have the MV La Julia. This was a ship that was owned by the Senegalese government, and despite the fact that it was designed to carry a maximum of 580 passengers, on September 26, 2002, the ship had at least 2,000 people on board. This is obviously a huge issue, and this, coupled with the fact that there was a large amount of people who were sleeping on the ship's deck, which is of course above the center of buoyancy, only made matters worse. The ship was en route to the Senegalese capital of Dakar, and as it sailed farther out to sea than it was licensed to sail, it ended up encountering a storm and really rough waters. The ship ended up capsizing, and out of the 2,000 people on board, only 64 people survived the entire ordeal. Not only was this because of the fact that the ship sank exceptionally quickly, but it's mostly because rescue was not sent out until several hours after. The wreck is thought to be one of the worst non-military disasters in all of maritime history. Despite the severity of the situation, no one has been charged or prosecuted for the disaster to this day. In our number 2 spot today, we have the MS Salam Boccaccio 98. This is a shipwreck that took place on the Red Sea on February 3rd, 2006. At the time of the wreck, the ship was en route from Dubai Dubai, UAE, on the way to Safaga in southern Egypt. When the ship left port, it was already listing due to poor weather, and things only got worse from here. A fire broke out in the engine room and it continued to burn despite the crew's best efforts to get it put out. The crew used buckets and buckets of seawater, and at one point the fire was temporarily put out, but it reignited before long. At this point, the captain tried to turn around and return to the port, but the drainage pumps weren't working properly, which meant that the hull of the ship had now filled up with water. When they tried to turn, it just resulted in the balance being all thrown off and the ship capsized. Like I mentioned before, when they set out, the weather was already bad, which of course made the rescue efforts substantially more difficult because those people also had to try and sail through this bad weather and strong winds. This left dozens out floating in the Red Sea. Sadly, it is reported that somewhere around 1,018 people lost their lives in this wreck. In our number 1 spot today, we have the MV Goya. This ship was built in Norway in 1940 and was meant to be a freighter, but in a World War II world, this ship ended up being used as a passenger ship in order to evacuate citizens as a part of Operation Hannibal. This, of course, as anyone could reasonably imagine, meant that the ship was very often overcrowded as they were trying to rescue as many people as possible at a time. On April 16th, 1945, the ship was carrying over 7,000 passengers, which is 5 times the amount of people it could safely carry, when it was hit by a torpedo that was sent from a Soviet submarine just before midnight. The force of the explosion was so great that the ship only took minutes to sink, and since the timing of the incident had most passengers in their beds, you can imagine the outcome. Because of a lack of proper record keeping in with the absolute panic of trying to rescue people with the imminent threat of attack, it isn't quite clear exactly how many people lost their lives in this wreck, but it's thought that somewhere between 6,000 to 7,000 passed away, which is unbelievable. It is thought that there were around 180 survivors of the wreck, and due to the unbelievable tragedy, the location of it has now been officially declared a war grave by the Polish authorities. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you next time. Bye!